It's spooky for this video. Hey, I'm LizzAnn. If you're new, welcome to my channel. I am happy to have you. I created this series on my YouTube channel where I post nothing but spooky, fall, and Halloween related content for the months of September and October. And we called it Lizzoween. And this is episode 10 of Lizzoween. This is the second last episode. I am dressed as my bat. Again, you guys seen it in my previous episode. I am obsessed with this jacket, so I had to wear it again. And it is perfect for telling ghost stories. Yeah, that's what we're going to be doing for episode 10 of Lizzoween. We are going to be telling ghost stories. I have 3 books here, and I picked out some of them. I'm joined here with my dog, Moo, who's also a bat because I don't want to be here alone downstairs. And I have my bat juice. It's Pepsi. Alright, anyways, let's get into reading these ghost stories. So the first one is Haunted Canada 2, True Tales of Terror. And the first one is Mary Rutherford's Grave, and it's in Hanover, Ontario. It's a sad story, the story of Mary Rutherford, and scary too. It may not be true, but that doesn't stop people from telling it. No one knows how or why it began, but over the years its strands have been woven into a spine-tingling tale that can still send a group of teenagers, usually boys, scrumbling and screaming out of the cemetery, as fast as their nikes can carry them. The cemetery they run from is an old one in West Bentinck near Hanover, Ontario. It's where Mary Rutherford's grave is supposed to be, off by itself on a hill towards the back of the property. But the inscription on the solitary headstone says that Isabella, not Mary Rutherford, was buried there in 1872. When she was 72 years old, further research shows that Isabella married happily and had children and grandchildren. Would there be any reason for her ghost to be haunting this spot? Not likely, but what if Mary Rutherford really is buried on the hill? The spirit of someone who suffered as she did might very well linger in that area. Mary Rutherford is said to have died when she was still in her 30s. Long after her friends had married and settled down to a happy life raising a family, she finally met the man of her dreams. Thrilled, she planned her wedding, but when the big day arrived, she was left standing alone. Before the preacher, her bridegroom had skipped town the night before, overcome by shame and heartbreak, and still wearing her wedding dress, Mary hung herself. Even though her death was a suicide, she was buried in the cemetery, but off by herself on the hill wearing her wedding dress and lying face down in her coffin. Her spirit, though, couldn't find peace, and her ghost, perhaps still waiting for her lover, appears there to this day. This is the story that every now and then draws a small group of young people to the graveyard late at night. One of them issues an "I dare you," "I challenge," and off they go. What's there to be afraid of? After all, the name on the gravestone they're going to spend time near says Isabella, not Mary. So the young buried bride story can't possibly be true, can it? But when they reach their spooky destination under cover of darkness, only the bravest among them dares to touch the headstone, defying the claim that if you do, you'll break a bone in the future. And if they see it, the whispered glow that appears on the side of the hill, or the shadowy, shimmering figure of a woman moving through the trees, the bravely slips away, and so do they, back to the safety of their homes. And every now and then, a few weeks later, if one of them breaks an arm or a leg, or even just a big toe, they all remember that night they spent at the graveyard checking out the tragic tale of Mary Rutherford. Spooky! The next one is The Headless Sea Captain. And this one is in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. The year was 1745. The place was St. John's, Newfoundland. The location was a house that a beautiful young woman had called home since years before a man named Samuel Pettyham started renting it. Add betrayal and jealousy, and the stage is set for a tale of terror recorded more than 250 years ago, and passed down from generation to generation ever since. Pettyham hadn't been living in the house very long. He started feeling a little uncomfortable there. What spooked him most was the way the latches on the front and back doors kept lifting mysteriously at night. When he'd fling open the doors to see who was trying to get in, there'd be no one outside. Pettyham found the latch lifting disturbing, but not enough to make him want to move. Instead, he just made sure every evening that both doors were bolted as well as latched. But one night something happened that nearly scared him to death. He was coming home from a friend's place when he noticed a strange glow ahead. As he got closer, he saw what looked like a silhouette of a person standing at the end of the street near his front door. Could this be the culprit who'd be trying to get into the house? Pettyham took a few more steps, then froze, petrified. Now he could see that the tall figure before him was a man with no head. Pettyham bolted back up the street and around the first corner. Trembling, he pounded on the door of a nearby rooming house and begged to let him in. The owner did let him in and managed to calm him down enough to find out what happened. Only then did Pettyham learn of the beautiful woman who used to live in the house, and of the two men who had loved her. One had been a neighbor, the other a tall, handsome English sea captain who would visit her whenever he docked his ship in St. John's Harbor. Eventually, the neighbor had found out about the captain's late-night visits to the woman he thought was his sweetheart. One evening when the captain's ship was in the port, he went to the girlfriend's house, and seizing with jealousy and rage, he waited in the shadows, watching the front door. The moment the captain stopped out of the welding a razor-sharp sword. One vicious swing was all it took. Seconds later, the captain lay dead in the street, his bloody head close by. According to the owner of the boarding house, Pettyham had just seen the sea captain's ghost. Others in the neighborhood had seen it before, and still others would see it again. The murderer was never caught, so perhaps the captain's spirit kept returning to the scene of the crime to find him. Whatever the reason, that night in 1745, Samuel Pettyham had no intention of returning home to the spectre of the headless captain. And going to bed, he rented a room where he was and spent the rest of the worst night of his life there. You scared yet, Moo? Just scared yet, Moo? Okay. And then I have two from this book, and this is The Unexplained, a Haunted Canada book. Elise saw her first. Isn't that a little girl up ahead? She sees a rose-colored shawl around her. She can't be more than 8 or 9 years old. Is anyone with her? What is she doing alone in those hills? Willis asked. There isn't a house for miles. It was a vivid spring day, when the grass was brightest green and the water in the river shimmed in the sun. Wildflowers were blooming in the nearby woods, and dandelions filled the ditches. Willis slowed the car as they neared the spot where the child stood, gazing at them. Pale gold, curly-haired, framed, pinched triangular face, and her gray eyes were steady. With one hand, she was clutching the shawl close around her against the spring breeze. With the other, she held a bouquet of wildflowers. Willis barked to a stop as Elise rolled down the car window. Can we give you a ride, dear? You must have walked a long way for those flowers. The child looked down on her dusty boots and then at the car. Here, let me open that door for you. Willis went around to the other side of the car to help her. I'm not sure your mother has told you not to bribe strangers, he said gently, but we can't leave you alone way out here. It will be dark before long. The little girl clambered up into the wide back seat with her flowers and sat stiffly as the doors were closed beside her. Elise asked, "What is your name, dear?" "Annie," she whispered. "Well, Annie, let us know when we come to your house." Willis broke the silence of the ride once or twice with comments about the beauty of the day or the sight of the high-flying eagle. The little girl responded only to Elise. "Where's your house?" Elise asked. "Up there." Were you out walking by yourself?" "Yes." "Are those heptics?" "Yes." "What color is your house?" "White house, round to bend." Elise concentrated on watching for a white house. On Willis's drove, round it bending after bend. But the shadows were long before they finally saw a roof ahead. The place appeared to be old and abandoned. "This can't be your house, Annie," said Willis as they drove before the sagging building. The windows had been boarded over, and the veranda was falling off. There was no sign of life anywhere. It was hard to say that if the house had ever been white, as there was not a fleck of paint left on the old boards. Elise turned to ask again if they had the right place. The back seat was empty. "Willis, she's gone." "She can't be. The door never opened." "Turn the car, Willis. Maybe she fell out." "Don't be ridiculous," he said. "I tell you, the door never opened." But he wheeled around in the overgrown driveway and headed back the way they had come. They traveled as far as the place where they had picked up the child, until complete darkness settled over the hills. Willis and Elise drove back and forth along that road. They peered into the woods, up the green slopes, and across the river, trying to penetrate the depending shadows, but there was no little girl in a rose-colored shawl. Spooky! And then the last spooky story is Who's Invisible Now? By Carlene Bradford. It doesn't say where it's from. "Don't sit on Eleanor," Jane screamed. Her mother's best friend was Miss Tripp leaped back up from the chair upon which she was about to sit and spilled her tea. She looked at Jane's mother and raised one eyebrow. "Eleanor's still with us, I see," she said, mopping at the spilt tea on her lap with her handkerchief. "Really, Jane, this business of your invisible friend is becoming a nuisance." Miss Lister said, running for the paper towels. "I'm sorry, Miss Tripp," Jane said. "She was just sitting there for a minute, waiting for me to come so we could go up to my room." Jane dear," Miss Tripp said, looking over at her, the tops of her huge black-rimmed glasses. "Don't you think you'd be happier with a real friend? My Susie would love to see more of you, I know." Jane muttered something that tried to sound polite and ran from the room. Later on, when Miss Lester had come in to turn Jane's light off for the night, for the third time, she looked down at Jane and sighed. "Miss Tripp is right, you know, dear. You are really much too old to have an imaginary friend." "That's what little children do, and you're nearly 11. Why don't you try to forget about Eleanor and play more with Susie? She's such a delightful, well-adjusted child." "Eleanor is not imaginary," Jane replied sulkily. "She's just invisible, that's all. And you're always telling me to be loyal to my friends, so why shouldn't that include Eleanor? Anyway, Susie's not a delightful, well-adjusted child. She's a fink." "Really, dear? That word?" "It's not a bad word. It's in the dictionary. I looked it up. The last time you told me not to say it, if it's all right for the dictionary, it should be all right for me. And sure describes Susie. Fink. Spy, informator, unsavory person, jerk. That's Susie." "Jane, Susie's certainly not a spy." "Oh, yes, she is. She's the only one who told the whole class about Eleanor. After you told her mother, she eavesdropped when you two were talking, and then she told the whole world that's a spy, and she's a jerk because Eleanor said so." "Oh dear," Miss Lester sighed and left out the room, forgetting to turn the light off after all. Jane sighed too and turned the light off herself. She didn't really mind People not believing in Eleanor. After all, she couldn't expect them to, but it did make things difficult sometimes. The next morning, as she was coming down the stairs to breakfast, she heard her mother and father talking. She didn't mean to eavesdrop. She wasn't a spy. But she couldn't help overhearing the tail end of the conversation. "I don't know what to do about this Eleanor business. I really don't," her mother was saying. "Maybe if we get her busy doing other things," her father replied. "Maybe that would take her mind off Eleanor for a while." The next morning was school break, and Jane was certainly kept busy. Her mother stayed home from work and had something different planned for every day of the week. Movies one day, puppet show the next, shopping for shoes the next, visit to Susie's house the next. They even went to the zoo. Jane had a marvelous time. The evening before school started again, her mother and father called her back in the living room just as she was going to bed. "Did you enjoy yourself over the holiday?" her father asked. They were both looking at her expectantly. "Oh, I certainly did," Jane answered, her eyes shining. "And so did Eleanor, every minute of it, except for the visit to Susie's." She bounced out of the room. Miss Lester gave a shriek of despair. "I give up," Mr. Lester said, and retired into his newspaper. The next day after school, Jane's mother was waiting for her with a batch of freshly baked chocolate chip oatmeal cookies, her favorite kind. "Load up, Miss Lester," said her voice unsurely stern. "We're going to have a walk." They walked until dinner. Jane's mother explained partially why almost 11-year-old girls shouldn't have imaginary friends. "I mean invisible," she corrected herself quickly. "Playmates." They admired their neighborhood's lawns and gardens, stopped in for ice cream cone with the very unusual, this so close to dinner time, and after all those cookies too, thought Jane. Talked about school, then started back home. Miss Lester began to explain all over about invisible playmates and almost 11-year-old girls. But Jane suddenly interrupted her. "Just a moment, Mum," she said politely. "Eleanor thinks Mother's calling her." Eleanor exploded. "Eleanor," exploded Miss Lister. "What have I just been telling you? Eleanor doesn't exist." Just then, out of thin air, and only a child's breath away from Jane, a mother's impatient voice cried out, "Really, Eleanor? This business of your invisible friend? Jane is becoming a nuisance. I've called you 3 times for dinner. Now will you please come in?" Spooky. So, yeah, that's it. That is it for episode 10 of Lizzoween, reading spooky ghost stories. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I definitely had fun. Let me know which story was your favorite. Was it spooky? Let me know. Let me know all your comments down below. Give this video a big thumbs up.